Okay, welcome back. We're going to talk about the finishing up of the sheet. So let's share my screen. So I put in the formulas here and I've got the values coming out. Notice that the mode had two answers coming out, and that's because I use mode.mult. That means that there were multiple 42.3s and multiple 70.6s. You should use mode.mult when you're doing mode. And one thing to point out is that the mean comes out with 8 decimal places. In the milestone, it's very important that you format these so that you don't see that many decimal places because you're going to want to talk about these things. And so what I would do is just highlight all of your statistics and then do some formatting here. Do that like that. So I can do it one at a time. 1 decimal place is fine. So I'm using the increase, decrease decimal places. Some of them had too many, some of them had too few. That now they all have 1 decimal place. Um, it's a part of the processing of the numbers, right? Thinking about, do I have more decimal places than I need? That's the most common problem. Sometimes, did I get less decimal places than I need to be able to see differences? Okay, so I didn't update my title and my axis labels, but you should, and all of that looks like then it would be done. So let me pull up the directions, histogram, descriptive statistics. Good. So in the second part, you're going to do this second city, and you're welcome to choose any city you want from here. I would just say make sure you change this. So this would be whatever city you're doing, Seattle, temp statistics. And you're putting in the data, you're doing all the same work. You got to build a histogram, you got to do the measures of center, the measures of spread, and then we're going to pick it up on the comparison sheet. Yep, yep. Okay. So I'm gonna well, I guess there's no point really in stopping this video because we haven't said anything, but you obviously have work to do in terms of the second sheet. So go ahead and look at that and we'll pick it up on the comparison. Okay, I've got myself set up over here, and I'm doing precipitation because I don't want to spoil your fun for the temperature work. Um, and I've got my data here. You don't need to do this part because your values are all going to be imported in from the previous sheet. So if you've done all that work, it should link all of your answers directly. If for some reason that got deleted or you typed in numbers and then you realize you didn't need to do that, all you need to do to make a cell reference to another sheet is start with the equal sign and then you go over to, say, the mean in Chicago, and then you press enter and it'll bring the number over for it. Now notice that the rounding in that cell is not the same as over here, so you have to fix that. And in fact, that's a big problem here, that all of these numbers are coming out as zeros for the most part. And I really need to see more information here. So I'm going to go, even 1 decimal place with precipitation is not necessarily enough. So I'm going to go all the way to 3 decimal places. With precipitation, the units are inches. So IN is my abbreviation for that. If your temperature, your units are going to be degrees Fahrenheit, and you can just say F for that. I guess I should be consistent here. Temperature units are degrees Fahrenheit, and then you could just say F. Okay, so um, I'm going to go through the work and kind of explain some of this because this is really a significant part of what you're going to be graded on in milestone 2 is your ability to talk about what you did. And in general, what you're doing in milestone 2 is you're comparing two cities in terms of their weather. That's very broad, and it allows you to talk about the things that you want to talk about. You did 3 different aspects in milestone 2. In this one, I'm talking about precipitation. You're going to talk about temperature. A really important place to start is, can I interpret any one of these numbers, right? And what we learned last week was that when we talk about measures of center, we can use framings of typical or average. So, for instance, I might say a typical day in Anchorage sees 0.064 inches of precipitation. Okay. So I need to be able to do this level of interpretation. This is not comparative, but it's an interpretation of the actual data point. And I've made a little slide for you. Let me pull that up to kind of go over some of the do's and don'ts of interpretation. So we want to use the number. We want to explain the significance of the number, and we want to explain the number in relation to other values if it's helpful. And so you can see that I'm doing the two things here that are on my do list in that sentence. It's not a complicated sentence. It's very short. A typical day, and then I have the number and I have the units. In fact, I should put into here, include the units. When you're trying to, sometimes students think that explaining or interpreting means tell me how you did it. Like I added up all the numbers, I divided by how many there are. That's how I'm explaining what the mean is. That does tell me that's how you do the mean, and it's accurate, but it's not what I'm looking for in terms of interpretation. Okay, so let's go back to our Excel file. The question is, which city has more precipitation? And if I put these two sentences of just talking about a typical day next to each other, so I'm going to put Minneapolis here next, and 0.074, then it should be clear that a typical day in Minneapolis has more precipitation because this number is higher than this number. So these two sentences actually could form a part of my answer to this question, right? And again, I'm going to copy and paste because I'm kind of a lazy guy. And then I'll do the same thing for here. I'm going into the cell to copy and then going into the cell to paste because that you saw what happened when I did it the first time and didn't like what I was doing. Also, this needs to be seen as a paragraph. So I'm going to use that wrap text button to, I've written so much that it's kind of spilling out the edges there. Okay. So based on this, I can see that Minneapolis has more precipitation in general, right? It doesn't mean that every single day in Minneapolis has more precipitation than any day in Anchorage. It just means that in general, Minneapolis has more precipitation. And I've brought the evidence in to see that, right? Notice that the median is 0, and that's interesting. And it means that if I was using the median as evidence, it would look like they have the same level of precipitation, which is that they don't have any precipitation. So the median is not a good number to cite here. It may be in temperature, you can use mean or median, but for precipitation, typically, because the way rain and precipitation works, it doesn't happen actually most of the time. Most days don't have any precipitation. I know when it's raining in Chicago, it feels like it's raining all the time, but in fact, it's not raining all the time. And so the median often will come up as 0 for precipitation. Okay. So again, talking about measures of center, typical should be a pretty straightforward way to interpret either one. And your question is which city is warmer? You should be able to talk about what's typical and then make a conclusion sentence about which city is warmer based on that. Okay. Now let's talk about range and standard deviation because we haven't really talked about how to interpret range and standard deviation. I'm going to erase this. All right. So talking about range, there's really two different ways I can talk about it. But I'll give you both ways and then you can kind of decide which one sounds better to you. So range can either be, well, hold on, let me get this resource. Okay, so what I did is I brought in some kind of generic formulations for range. And one of the things that's important here are don't use the word data. Try to be specific about what you're talking about. And then, of course, you're replacing the capital letters with actual numbers here. So if I'm talking about the first interpretation, I need to know what the min and the max are. And in precipitation, that's easy. If you were talking about Chicago, you may need to go back and look at your min and max to be able to make that sentence. So I'm going to do the first one here. I'm going to start with the word data, and I'm going to go circle back and change it later. The data is between 0 inches and 1.519 inches for Anchorage. Okay, so again, this is not a good sentence yet because the data is like, what am I even talking about? I'm not being clear about the context. And notice that I'm starting with, again, I'm not jumping into the comparison. I'm starting with how do I interpret a single data point so that I can then make the comparison, right? You have to start with how do I talk about a single data, a single statistic. So the precipitation in Anchorage ranges from, or is between, goes from 0 inches to 1.519 inches. And I already said acreage. So that's a way to interpret range. Another way to interpret range, I'll do it with Minneapolis. The biggest and smallest values for precipitation in Minneapolis are 1.38 inches away from each other. So these are two different ways to interpret the range. One just states the range number and says this is how far away the top and the bottom are. And the other one actually says that it goes from this value up to this value. And you could say both of them because they are slightly different ways, but they're both good ways to interpret the range. Let me do the standard deviation interpretation, and then we'll kind of decide what we're actually going to say here. Because this is actually a fairly interesting example where, depending on the measure that I use, I'm going to come up with a different conclusion. So standard deviation is a way of talking about the average distance from the center for a data point in my set. So let me just write out what I just said. The standard deviation is a way to measure the average distance from the mean, the center, in my data set. So on average, data points, and again, data points is too vague. So I want to talk about what I'm talking about here. Days in Anchorage varied by 0.167 inches from the mean. And then I could say something similar for Minneapolis. .210 inches from the mean, right? So we're talking about how much on average, how far away on average were these individual data points from the center. So what's interesting here is that higher measures of spread indicate more variation, and that the flip side of that is that lower measures of spread indicate less variation, and that's more consistency is the way we would say that. So this question is asking what city is more consistent. That's actually asking about less variation, right? So where is there less variation? Well, it depends on how I measure it, because if I measure it by range, the lower number is in Minneapolis. But if I measure it by standard deviation, then the lower number is in Anchorage. So actually, I could answer it either way, or I could go full complication and say, well, it's mixed. We look at the range, we can see that Minneapolis has a more consistent level of precipitation because it's a smaller number. But if we look at the standard deviation, then Anchorage has less variation and more consistency. So that's how I would finish this paragraph. I would pick, personally, I would pick one of the things and then say both things and then finish with my comparison sentence. So you can see the structure here in the first, you have a statement of one of the measures of center. You've got a statement of the other measure of center. Sorry, you have an interpretation, not just a statement, right? I'm not just saying the standard deviation is 0.167 inches in Anchorage. That doesn't interpret or give me any context about what's happening in this situation. Then I move into the comparison. Okay. This is hard work. So don't feel like if you're thinking, oh my God, this is hard. That's accurate. It is hard. And again, it's a real example of how the math class is challenging. It's that it's not necessarily just doing the math or getting the answer. We have to be able to do something with the answer. Okay, let me just go back and look at the directions. I think we're done with this assignment. Yep. That's it. Okay, I'm going to stop my share. So workbook 7, you should submit that. I am going to extend the due date 1 day. So it's due, I'm going to shift everything back 1 day. So the soft deadline will be set Friday and the hard deadline will be Sunday. And if you get stuck, remember, I'm just a text away for help. And you should include a screenshot or a picture of whatever you're struggling with. So I have the context of what the problem is. Okay, I'm going to stop there. And also remember that, of course, there is a workbook walkthrough that you can use in addition to these videos.